Yours haven't gone up at all. You're spending $90 billion a year. Go away.
Ronald Reagan once talked about abolishing the Department of Education. That was a good idea. Education's a local responsibility. We don't gain by shipping money from South Carolina to Washington so that Washington can scarf off a piece and send it back. Federal spending on education's gone up by billions and billions, as that chart shows. But the bottom of the graph, those lines are the reading, math, and science scores. They are flat. We've gotten nothing noticeable from all that increase in spending. Why? Where does the money go? Our next guest should have an idea. Sherry Street helped start the first significant voucher program in America in Milwaukee. Joel Klein, until last year, ran the New York City public school system. So either of you, where'd all that money go?
I'll tell you where it's gone. We've spent a ton of money hiring a whole lot more teachers and other people in the school system.
Well, that should be good. Oh,
and
more teachers.
No, it is, but we're not getting any return for it, right? And part of the reason is because we're running a state-run monopoly and not giving people real choices in this matter. Second thing we paid a ton for is seniority. Even though you have a workforce that's locked in, we keep paying them more each year, and that's not working for us. The other thing we pay for is credentials, and Bill Gates and others have done studies on this showing that there's no value for the credentials. So we have a very, if you will, worker-friendly environment. We just don't have a student-friendly environment. And whether we spend a lot of money or we don't spend a lot of money, if we don't spend it intelligently, we're not going to get the results.
Sherry?
I would agree with that. And I can tell you that in South Carolina, children, it's the per pupil funding for students is around $12,000 on average. But
and let's just stop and do the math there. $12,000 per student, and South Carolina is not the richest state.
Not the wealthiest, not
per
the biggest.
classroom, that's more than $200,000. Think what you could do. $200,000 per classroom. You could hire 3 great teachers, right? But that's what they spend, and I'm sorry to interrupt.
And that would be great if that came to the classroom. But what we found is only about 43.5 cents goes to instruction. The rest of the money goes to administration.
Well, you need some administration.
You do need some administration, but with only 43.5 cents going per dollar per pupil to the classroom, I don't think that's quite fair. So,
now, this General Accounting Office report just said there are 82 duplicative programs to improve teacher quality. I mean, there's the Teachers for a Competitive Tomorrow, Teacher Quality Partnership Grants, Improving Teacher Quality State Grants, and on for 79 more. I would think if you could fire a bad teacher, that would improve quality just by itself.
I think you're right. When I saw that report, John, I said, boy, they must have had you in mind when they did it. But when you give people little programs to run, inevitably, that's what they're going to do. And there's zero accountability. Whether they're good programs, some of these programs may be good. But whether they're good or bad or not, who knows? And each year they get reauthorized.
Because it's a government monopoly. And I just love hearing you use that word. Because when I first interviewed you years ago, and I did a show called Stupid in America, I interviewed the head of the union that you had to negotiate with. And I said, well, it's a government monopoly. They never get better. And she said, people who use words like that don't like children.
No,
and now you're using it. I like it.
John,
it is a monopoly.
Ridiculous. It is, of course. It's a monopoly in the classic sense, right? Whether you do a good job or a bad job, you get the same number of kids each year. I mean, what Bayo and these organizations are doing is trying to say, wait a second. How about you earn the right to educate my child? Not just that you're there, but you earn it. And if you're not good, and there's a charter school next door or another program, they get the kid. Now, that's what a classic monopoly, in fact, in terms of government is. It means whatever happens, you're going to get the same number of kids next year. You know what that incentivizes? It doesn't incentivize innovation, doesn't incentivize accountability, doesn't incentivize good outcomes. What it does incentivize is people can stay their lifetime in a job without any consequences whatsoever, good, bad, or indifferent.
And what would change that is if the money were attached to the kid, and the parent might say, oh, this school is better. And that's what you introduced in Milwaukee. People say, Milwaukee scores aren't that much better in those voucher schools.
But what
a little better, but not a lot.
That's true. But what we have done is we've changed the dynamic of the power. Who is in charge of the power and the money? What we want to do is empower parents. They know better than any bureaucrat what's best for their children. And so when we give parents the power to vote with their feet, then our monopolies, as you mentioned, have to take notice, because that's what they want to protect.
So why haven't we seen more impressive results? You don't have a critical mass to have a market, or?
Well,
I thought I thought that would be night and day.
I think there are a number of us who've been in this movement for a long time that thought that too. And I think that we do see improvement in academic scores in charter schools and other independent schools, and that will continue to increase.
And the public schools may have improved just to compete.
To compete some, but I think two points that are worth noting here. Milwaukee's a very small program. That's not to excuse it, and I think there were some errors. But look, nobody who's watching us doesn't insist on choice for his or her kids. Nobody says, well, whatever the neighborhood school, if it's crummy, I'll go there, it doesn't matter. People insist on choice. Why should the people who are the poorest and the most challenged get a one-and-done approach to public education? Right now in Harlem, if you have a kid going to kindergarten, you could send them to 20 different charter schools. And empowering parents has mattered. 2 independent studies by 2 different people who have looked at those kids who applied to the charter and got in, and those who applied to the charter and didn't get in. And time and again, they're showing the ones who went to the charters are getting better and better results. Look, there's no silver bullet. There's going to be no simple formula. But you make a bet on empowering the consumer in virtually everything. People who are watching tonight chose to watch. They had lots of options. One and done doesn't work, and we surely shouldn't think it's going to work for our neediest, most challenged, poorest kids in America.
We agree on choice. Last question. Should a federal education department exist at all? Joel?
Yes.
Well,
I think, because I think it's one of the few areas where the parties have come together to try to incentivize real change. You know, when President Obama gets out and speaks boldly for charter schools, that changes the discussion. Now, there are programs that we could talk about that I think could be, you know, not being
He
well
can speak
funded.
out without having a federal department spending $80 billion.
He used $4.5 billion. He and Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education,
Race to the top.
Race to the top. It had huge. It helped me lift the charter cap here in New York State.
Can we cut out most of the money? Just leave the $4.5 billion?
Well, there are other things they're supporting. But no, look, all of these federal programs are going to have to be looked at, and looked at with a very, very tight eye.
Thank you, Joel Klein. Thank you, Sherry Street. Coming up, could ending the war on drugs solve race relations in America? That's next. America has a race problem. We elected a black president, that's true, but it doesn't change the fact that 1 in 9 young black men is in jail, more than 10%. Doesn't change the fact that many blacks don't trust the police and sometimes won't help the police. Both problems could be solved, says John McWhorter, if we just got rid of one big, ugly federal program. So what's the program?
The war on drugs. It must end. And it should end, frankly, yesterday.
But the war on drugs is supposed to help those young people. Why?
It helps nothing. And what people don't realize is that not only is it not working, but we have a situation where police officers are assigned to trawl through black communities. They're doing that because it's their job, because we have a war on drugs. And you have young black boys in particular who grow up thinking of the police and therefore by extension white people as an enemy. Then they go out into a world where white people run things and they're not very well equipped to deal with it. And in addition, you have a black market because drugs are sold at a markup because they're illegal. And the simple fact is, if there were no war on drugs, there would be no way to make even a semblance of a living standing out on the corners trying to sell drugs. And as a result, and this is what people miss, as a result, these men would get jobs and black America would be an infinitely better place.
Before the drug war, many more black men had jobs.
They did, and this is something people miss. And so, for example, nobody would want to live in an old-time black ghetto. But for example, in the 1940s, in black Indianapolis, 93% of able-bodied black men had jobs. Glamorous jobs, no. It was a horrible time, but they worked. And the simple thing is that it's better for a person to do legal work. There was no such thing as, well, I don't work, well, I'm out on them corners, et cetera, et cetera. That didn't exist. People worked, and therefore the two-parent family, even in poor black communities, was a norm. We should go back to that.
You could say that's not because of the drug war, that's because of welfare. That changed that.
We've worked on the problem as regards women, and welfare being a program that's about teaching people how to get and keep a job, rather than welfare being a program that doesn't care whether you get a job. Now we have to deal with the men. And as far as the men go, the way to make the men get jobs is to have a situation where they have no choice but to do so, upon which they will enjoy it, and their children will watch them working.
If drugs are legal, maybe they'll all get stoned.
And they will not. We've seen this because in European countries, for example, where the drug war has been relaxed or largely eliminated, Portugal is a beautiful example. There's been found no societal breakdown, no remotely significant increase in addiction. There are more funds freed up for rehab. All of these things are extremely important. And John, this is one important thing. Even if, because a lot of people when they hear this argument say, well, the economy is in tatters, what kind of work is available for especially undereducated young men of any color? And the fact is, it wouldn't be a picnic. No, they're not going to be executives, probably never in their lives. But anything that those men did, anything at all, would be better than standing out on a corner, getting shot, and leaving children to recapitulate that life.
You write that because of the drug war, time in prison is now viewed as a badge of honor.
Because the war on drugs, as I think anyone knows on a certain level, is not fair. And because people in these communities quite justly think of the police as an invading army, the idea that you went to prison when you really shouldn't have and you dealt with it means that you have been able to show yourself to be a man in what, unfortunately, by default, is one of the only ways that you can do something like that in communities of that kind. And so, for example, you have people walking around with T-shirts saying, "Stop snitching." So you have these communities where people are telling one another to not help the police to keep people from killing themselves in their own neighborhoods.
But legalization means everything legal, sold in the corner store.
Oh, yeah.
Heroin, the whole deal.
This is not
terrifying to people.
This is not some boring point about pot. Legalization of marijuana, that's nice. That's a whole different set of issues. I'm talking about the hard stuff. I'm talking about heroin on sale at the drugstore.
Pathmark. Zip down to the neighborhood,
terrifying.
Pathmark, and
just
buy
like if
crack.
You were some lady in 1915 with an anti-macassard sofa and you were worried about the idea of bourbon being sold at the store. Well, heavens, you would clutch your pearls. We have gotten used to it, and that is exactly the way we need to look at it now. Nice, carefully administered, and certified clean doses of these drugs available for sale, so that, this is not about libertarian philosophy for me, the idea is that if you can buy it at the store, there's no way to make a living selling it on the street, and therefore no more serious crisis in Black America.
Well, I hope we come to see that.
Oh, we're going to. We have to.
Thank you, John McWhorter. When we return, I want to yell not just at the government, but at the media about those painful and draconian cuts they keep talking about. That's nonsense.
What are you doing with our money? You really think you can spend our money better than we can? How dare you take our money that way?
I've been yelling at Washington for years, but this is the first year, the first time that I felt I had company. The Tea Party was yelling too. And now a few Republicans are proposing what sound like serious cuts. With the debt growing, we need serious cuts. But when these few politicians talk about cuts, the big spenders act like they're being bludgeoned.
The Republicans continued pushing a budget plan that calls for decimation, stagnation, and complacency.
They want to have a fire sale. They want to sell off our country.
A fire sale? They never want to sell anything. They ought to have a fire sale. Whole departments should be sold. But government just grows. And the mainstream media echoes this hysterical reaction to cuts. NPR and the Washington Post run headlines about deep spending cuts. Give me a break. Congress increased spending 60% this decade. Since when is cutting less than 2% of that a deep cut?
The Republicans want to cut $61 billion, which may sound like a lot, except it's less than a third of what the U.S. will spend this year just on interest on the debt. And that's about an eighth of this year's budget deficit. And it's just a tiny percentage of this year's federal spending. A $61 billion cut doesn't seem very deep now.
Harry Reid and the media keep calling the proposed cuts draconian. Really? Draconian? The word draconian comes from Draco. He was one of the first Greek political bosses. It was said he wrote laws in blood. Steal a head of cabbage, put him to death. The Harry Potter author was probably inspired by Draco when she named one of her evil characters Draco Malfoy.
And I'm Malfoy. Draco Malfoy.
Later, the kid went on to try to kill Harry Potter. So, attempted murderer, cruel executioner. Is draconian the right word to use when talking about a less than 2% budget cut? We need to cut 2%. We need to cut 50%. This hysteria over a less than 2% cut reminds me of the hysteria when Republicans got President Clinton to sign the welfare reform law.
Today we are taking an historic chance to make welfare what it was meant to be, a second chance, not a way of life.
Some people predicted trauma we haven't known since the cholera epidemics. Families will fracture. 1 million children could be forced into poverty. It didn't happen. Nearly 2 million children rose out of poverty. Welfare caseloads fell by half.
Life got better, especially for poor people. Likewise, life will get better if we cut government. Heck, we don't even have to cut spending to balance the budget if we just slowed the growth of government to 2% a year. Assuming normal economic growth, we'd balance our budget by 2020. But the politicians won't even do that. They would call that draconian. Give me a break. But that's our show for tonight. I'm John Stossel. Good night.